The Arizona desert was burning hot that afternoon in 1873. The sun beat down on the rocky hills like it was trying to cook everything alive. Thomas Reed wiped the sweat from his forehead and squinted into the distance. He was a cavalry scout, barely 23 years old, but already he'd seen more violence than most men see in a lifetime. Thomas and his patrol had been tracking what they thought were Apache raiders for 2 days. The tracks led them deeper into the harsh wilderness, where every rock could hide danger and every shadow could mean death. His commanding officer had warned them to stay alert. Apache warriors were known for their skill in ambush tactics, and this territory belonged to them long before any white man set foot here. The attack came without warning. One moment everything was quiet except for the sound of hooves on rocky ground. The next moment bullets were flying and men were shouting, the air filled with dust so thick Thomas could barely see his own hand in front of his face. Horses screamed and scattered in all directions. In the confusion, Thomas found himself separated from the rest of his unit. His heart pounded as he tried to figure out which way to go. Through the brown cloud of dust, he saw a figure running toward a cluster of rocks. The person wore traditional Apache clothing and moved quickly, clearly trying to escape. Thomas reacted on instinct. He'd been trained to capture, not kill when possible. He spurred his horse forward and managed to cut off the escape route. The chase lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like hours. Finally, Thomas cornered the figure behind a large boulder. He jumped from his horse, ready for a fight. But when he grabbed his captive and spun them around, Thomas froze in complete shock. This wasn't a warrior at all. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 years old. Her long black hair was tied back and her dark eyes blazed with an anger so fierce it actually made Thomas take a step back. She wasn't crying or begging. She wasn't showing any fear at all. Instead, she stood there with her chin up, staring at him like she was challenging him to do his worst. Thomas had no idea what to do. His training hadn't prepared him for this situation. He couldn't just let her go. The desert was dangerous, full of scorpions, snakes, and other threats. She might not survive out here alone, but bringing her back to the fort would create all kinds of problems. What would his commander say? What would the other soldiers think? The girl said something in Apache that Thomas didn't understand. Her voice was strong and clear, not trembling at all. She wasn't pleading. If anything, she sounded like she was giving him orders. Thomas wished he knew what she was saying. He tried to explain in English that he wasn't going to hurt her, but she just kept staring at him with those burning eyes. By now, the sounds of fighting had faded into the distance. Thomas realized his patrol had moved on, probably thinking he'd been killed or captured himself. He was alone in Apache territory with a prisoner who looked like she'd rather die than cooperate. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, and Thomas knew he had to make a decision fast. He tried to communicate using hand gestures. He pointed to himself and said his name slowly. Then he pointed at her with a questioning look. She said nothing. She didn't even blink. It was like staring at a statue, except this statue was radiating pure defiance. Thomas had never met anyone quite like her. He decided the only option was to head toward Fort Bowie. It would take about 3 days on horseback, maybe longer if he had to go carefully. Thomas motioned for the girl to get on his horse. She didn't move. He tried again, speaking softly, trying to show he meant no harm. Still nothing. Finally, he had to physically help her onto the horse, and even then she sat rigid as a board, refusing to hold on to anything. As they started moving, Thomas kept thinking about what had just happened. This girl had been running from the fight, not participating in it. Maybe she wasn't a raider at all. Maybe she was just someone who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Just like him, but it was too late now. He'd made his choice, and now they were both stuck with the consequences. The first night came quickly. Thomas made camp in a small canyon that offered some protection from the wind. He built a small fire and tried to offer the girl some dried meat and water. She refused both. She sat as far away from him as possible, her back against a rock, watching him with those same fierce eyes. Thomas ate his meal in uncomfortable silence, very aware that this angry young woman probably wished him dead. He tried talking to her again, explaining that he was taking her somewhere safe, that he wouldn't hurt her. But talking to her was like talking to the wind. She gave him absolutely nothing. No response, no reaction, nothing at all. Thomas finally gave up and wrapped himself in his blanket, though he knew he wouldn't sleep much. How could he with a hostile prisoner just a few feet away? As Thomas lay there staring at the stars, he wondered what would happen when they reached the fort. Would they put her in chains? Would they send her to one of those reservations he'd heard about? The thought made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite explain why. This girl was supposed to be his enemy. That's what they'd told him during training. But looking at her now, small and alone under the vast desert sky, she just seemed like a scared kid trying to act brave. What Thomas didn't know was that this accidental capture would change both their lives forever. He had no idea that the fierce Apache girl glaring at him across the campfire had a name that meant brave one in her language. Her name was Nalin, and she was about to show him that bravery came in forms he'd never imagined. But all of that would come later. For now, they were just two strangers thrown together by the chaos of war, neither one sure if they'd survive to see another sunrise. The second day of their journey was even harder than the first. Nalin still hadn't spoken a single word to Thomas. She hadn't eaten anything either, despite his repeated offers of food. Thomas was getting worried. The desert heat was brutal, and going without food and water could kill a person quickly out here. But every time he tried to hand her something, she'd turn her head away like he was offering her poison. Thomas had never felt so frustrated in his entire life. He was trying to help, trying to keep her alive, but she treated him like he was the worst person in the world. Maybe in her eyes he was. He'd captured her, taken her away from her home, her people. Of course she hated him. But understanding why didn't make the silent treatment any easier to handle. What really unsettled Thomas was how closely Nalin watched everything. She wasn't just sitting there sulking, her eyes were constantly moving, taking in every detail of the landscape. She noticed which direction they were traveling. She tracked the position of the sun. At night, he caught her studying the stars like she was reading a map. It was clear she was memorizing the route, probably planning an escape. Thomas tried a different approach on the second day. Instead of offering her food directly, he just left some dried meat and a canteen of water within her reach, then moved away to give her privacy. When he looked back later, the water was gone, though the food remained untouched. It was a small victory, but at least she was drinking. That meant she wanted to survive, which was something. The landscape they traveled through was beautiful in a harsh kind of way. Red rocks rose up from the ground like ancient monuments. Cacti stood like silent guardians watching them pass. In the distance, mountains rose up against the bright blue sky. Thomas had grown up in Ohio, where everything was green and wet. This desert was like a different world entirely. He couldn't imagine living out here, surviving in this heat with limited water and scarce food. But Nalin's people had done exactly that for generations. On the third day, something changed. The tension between them was still thick enough to cut with a knife, but Thomas noticed Nalin looking at him differently. Not with quite so much pure hatred, more like she was trying to figure him out, studying him the way she studied the terrain. He wondered what she saw. A young man who was just following orders? Or something else? They made camp that evening in a spot where some scraggly trees provided a bit of shade. Thomas was exhausted from 3 days of riding in the heat and sleeping with one eye open. He made a fire, ate some of his rations, and checked on the horse. Nalin sat in her usual spot, watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Thomas was so tired he could barely think straight. He wrapped himself in his blanket and, despite his best efforts to stay alert, fell into a deep sleep. He had no idea how long he'd been sleeping when he felt someone shaking his shoulder. Thomas jerked awake, his hand automatically reaching for his gun. But then he realized it was Nalin standing over him. For a split second, he thought this was it. She was finally making her move. She could easily take his gun and shoot him or grab a rock and bash his head in while he slept. He'd given her the perfect opportunity, but Nalin wasn't attacking him. Instead, she was pointing urgently at something near his bedroll. Thomas's eyes adjusted to the darkness and his blood ran cold. There, coiled up just inches from where his head had been resting, was a huge rattlesnake. The creature's tail was raised, rattling out its deadly warning. One wrong move and Thomas would have rolled right onto it in his sleep. Thomas slowly, carefully moved away from the snake. Nalin stepped back too. They both watched as the rattlesnake, no longer feeling threatened, slowly uncoiled and slithered away into the darkness. Thomas's heart was hammering in his chest. That snake could have killed him. Nalin had saved his life. She could have let him die, could have let nature do what she probably wanted to do herself. But she didn't. For the first time since he'd captured her, Thomas looked into Nolan's eyes and saw something other than anger. He couldn't quite name what it was. Not friendship, certainly, but maybe a tiny bit of respect, or perhaps just a recognition that they were both human beings trying to survive in a dangerous world. Whatever it was, it felt like the first crack in the wall between them. Thomas didn't know how to thank her. He tried speaking, but the words felt clumsy and inadequate. Finally, he just placed his hand over his heart and nodded to her, hoping she'd understand the gesture meant gratitude. Nolan watched him for a long moment, her face unreadable in the firelight. Then for the first time she spoke a single word in English. Water. Her voice was hoarse from days of not speaking, but the word was clear. Thomas immediately grabbed his canteen and handed it to her. She drank deeply, then handed it back. That was all. No other words, no explanation for why she'd saved him. But something had shifted between them in that moment. They weren't quite enemies anymore, though they weren't friends either. They were something else, something without a name. That night, Thomas moved his bedroll closer to the fire and stayed awake much longer, thinking about what had happened. Nolan had shown him mercy when she could have chosen revenge. She'd proven she was better than the situation that had trapped them both. In the Apache culture he knew almost nothing about. What did that kind of mercy mean? Was it a point of honor? A moral code? Or had she simply decided that his death wouldn't help her situation? Thomas realized he knew absolutely nothing about this girl beyond what he could see. He didn't know if she had a family waiting for her somewhere. He didn't know if she was scared despite her brave face. He didn't know what dreams she had or what future she'd been planning before he'd ruined everything by capturing her. All he knew was that she'd saved his life when she didn't have to, and that single act had planted a seed of something in his heart. Guilt, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding that the people he'd been taught to see as enemies were not so different from him after all. The rest of that night passed quietly. Nolan eventually lay down to sleep, though Thomas noticed she kept one eye on him just as he'd been doing to her. They were still wary, still uncertain, but the dynamic had changed. When the sun rose on the fourth day of their journey, Thomas found that Nolan had already woken up. She was sitting by the dead fire, and for the first time, she'd eaten some of the dried meat he'd left out. It wasn't much, but it was progress. As they prepared to continue toward the fort, Thomas caught himself wondering what would happen when they arrived. Would this fragile thread of connection they'd formed be broken the moment they entered those fort walls? Probably. But for now, in this moment, there was something almost like peace between them. Fort Bowie appeared on the horizon like a small wooden island in an ocean of sand and rock. Thomas felt his stomach tighten as they got closer. He'd been so focused on just getting here alive that he hadn't thought much about what would happen next. Now, riding through the fort's gates with an Apache girl on his horse, he realized just how complicated things were about to become. The reaction was immediate. Soldiers stopped what they were doing and stared. Some reached for their weapons out of pure instinct. Others started whispering to each other, their voices carrying across the dusty parade ground. Thomas could feel Nolan stiffen behind him on the horse. She sat up straighter, her chin raised high, refusing to show any fear even though she must have been terrified. Thomas admired that about her. Even as he dreaded the confrontation he knew was coming. Captain Morrison came storming out of his office before Thomas even had a chance to dismount. The captain was a big man with a red face that got even redder when he was angry. Right now he looked like he was about to explode. "Reed, what in God's name is this?" Morrison bellowed, pointing at Nolan. "Where's the rest of your patrol? And why have you brought a hostile into my fort?" Thomas climbed down from his horse and stood at attention, though his legs were shaky from days of riding. He explained what had happened as quickly and clearly as he could. The ambush, getting separated, the capture. The captain's face got darker with every word. "You captured an Apache girl," Morrison repeated slowly, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Not a warrior, not a scout, a girl. And you thought the best course of action was to bring her here?" "I couldn't leave her in the desert, sir," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "She would have died out there alone." "That's not our problem, soldier," Morrison snapped. But even as he said it, Thomas could see the captain was struggling with the situation too. Fort Bowie had no facilities for keeping prisoners, especially not a young Apache woman. The jail was really just a storage room with a lock on the door. There were no proper guards, no system in place for this kind of thing. Around them, more soldiers had gathered to watch the spectacle. Thomas heard their comments, and they made his blood boil. Some called Nalin names he wouldn't repeat. Others made jokes about having an Apache pet. A few of the older soldiers, men who'd lost friends in raids, looked at Nalin with pure hatred in their eyes. Thomas wanted to tell them all to shut up, but he couldn't. He was in enough trouble already. Nalin sat perfectly still on the horse through all of this. She didn't understand all the English words being thrown around, but she definitely understood the tone. Thomas could see her hands trembling slightly, though her face remained calm and proud. That trembling made something twist in his chest. She was just a kid, really, scared and alone and surrounded by enemies, but she refused to let anyone see her fear. Captain Morrison finally made his decision. "We'll keep her here until I can arrange transport to the San Carlos reservation," he said. "Reed, since this is your mess, you're responsible for guarding her. Put her in the storage room and make sure she doesn't escape. If she causes any trouble, it's on your head. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, though his heart sank. He'd effectively been demoted to prison guard, and from the smirks on the other soldiers' faces, they all knew it. As he led Nalin toward the small storage building, he heard someone mutter, "Nursemaid," behind him. Laughter followed. The storage room was tiny and dark, with one small window that barely let in any light. It smelled like old leather and gun oil. There was nothing inside except some crates and a thin blanket someone had thrown in as an afterthought. This was where Nalin would have to stay, trapped like an animal in a cage. Thomas felt sick about it, but what choice did he have? He tried to make Nalin understand that he'd bring her food and water, that he'd make sure she was safe. She looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see right through him, then walked into the room without a word. The sound of the lock clicking into place felt like the worst thing Thomas had ever done. The next few days were miserable for everyone. Thomas spent most of his time sitting outside the storage room, enduring the mockery of the other soldiers. They'd walk by and make comments about him being a babysitter, about how he'd gone soft. Some suggested he'd captured the girl for other darker reasons, implications that made Thomas want to punch someone, but he kept his mouth shut and his fist to himself. Inside the room, Nalin barely moved. Thomas would bring her meals 3 times a day, and she'd eat just enough to survive. She never spoke, never asked for anything. Through the small window, Thomas could see her sitting against the wall, staring at nothing. Sometimes at night, he thought he heard her crying, but when he checked on her, her face was always dry and expressionless. What Thomas didn't know was that Nalin was using this time to study everything about the fort. From her small window, she could see a surprising amount of the compound. She watched the guards change shifts and learned their routines. She counted the number of soldiers and noted where the horses were kept. She observed how the gates opened and closed, who had keys, and when security was most relaxed. Her sharp mind was cataloging every detail, storing it away for future use. She also watched Thomas. She saw how the other soldiers treated him, how they'd turned him into an outcast for showing her basic human decency. She noticed that he always made sure her water was fresh and her food was the same quality as what the soldiers ate, not scraps. When it rained one night, he brought her an extra blanket without being asked. These small kindnesses didn't escape her notice. On the 5th day of her imprisonment, something happened that would change everything. One of the soldiers' wives, a woman named Helen who helped at the fort's small infirmary, came to see Thomas. She looked worried, almost scared. "We need to talk about what's happening in the fort," Helen said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else could hear. "People are getting sick. Really sick. I think it might be cholera." Thomas felt his blood run cold. Cholera was a death sentence in places like this. There was no cure, no real treatment. It spread fast and killed quickly, especially in the close quarters of a military fort. If cholera had really come to Fort Bowie, they were all in serious trouble. Within hours, Helen's fears were confirmed. 3 more people fell ill with the telltale symptoms: vomiting, fever, terrible stomach pains. The fort's single doctor, an overworked man named Dr. Patterson, looked like he'd aged 10 years in a single day. He knew what was coming. An outbreak in a place like this could kill dozens before it burned itself out. As panic began to spread through the fort, Thomas sat outside Nalin's door and wondered if they'd all die here in this godforsaken place. He thought about the bitter irony of surviving Apache raids and desert dangers only to be killed by invisible sickness. Through the locked door, he heard Nalin moving around, probably wondering why everything had suddenly gotten so chaotic outside. What happened next, nobody could have predicted. It would prove that sometimes the person you least expect can become your greatest ally. And it would show everyone in Fort Bowie that they'd been wrong about the angry Apache girl locked in a storage room. Dead wrong. By the third day of the outbreak, Fort Bowie was in complete chaos. 8 people were sick now, including 2 children. The sounds of people vomiting and crying echoed through the compound day and night. Dr. Patterson looked like he was about to collapse from exhaustion. He'd been working around the clock, but cholera was merciless. Nothing he tried seemed to help much. People kept getting worse. Thomas had been reassigned to help with the sick, which meant someone else was supposed to guard Nalin. But in all the confusion, nobody was paying much attention to the storage room anymore. Everyone was too busy trying to survive. Thomas felt guilty leaving her locked up with no explanation, but he had his hands full carrying water, emptying buckets, and trying to comfort terrified families. It was Helen who first suggested asking Nalin for help. Thomas was helping her clean up after one of the sick patients when she mentioned it. The Apache have lived in this harsh land for centuries, Helen said quietly. They must know things about healing that we don't. Medicine we've never heard of. Maybe that girl knows something that could help. Thomas immediately shook his head. Nobody's going to listen to an Apache about medicine. They barely tolerate her being here at all. People are dying, Thomas, Helen said firmly. At this point, what do we have to lose? She had a point. Thomas went to Dr. Patterson and suggested the idea. The doctor looked at him like he'd lost his mind. You want me to trust the health of these people to a savage girl who probably wants us all dead anyway? Do you have any better ideas? Thomas asked. It came out sharper than he intended, but he was tired and scared and watching people die. Dr. Patterson opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. His shoulders sagged. No, he admitted quietly. No, I don't have any better ideas. Nothing I'm doing is working. Bring her here, but if she tries anything at all, it's on your head. Thomas went to the storage room and unlocked the door. Nalin was sitting in her usual spot, but she stood up quickly when she saw him. She looked thinner than before, and there were dark circles under her eyes. Thomas tried to explain what was happening using hand gestures and the few Apache words he'd picked up. Sickness. Many people. Help needed. Nalin understood faster than he expected. She nodded and followed him out of the room. It was the first time she'd been outside in days, and Thomas saw her blink in the bright sunlight. Some soldiers stopped and stared as Thomas led her across the compound toward the infirmary. One started to object, but Thomas just kept walking. He didn't have time for their nonsense right now. The infirmary was a nightmare. Sick people lay on cots and on the floor. The smell was terrible. Children were crying. Adults were moaning in pain. Dr. Patterson looked up when Thomas and Nalin entered, his face a mixture of desperation and doubt. Nalin took one look around the room and immediately started speaking in Apache. Her words came fast and urgent. She pointed at various patients, then made gestures that Thomas couldn't quite interpret. He felt helpless not understanding her. She's trying to tell us something, Helen said. But what? Nalin seemed to realize the problem. She took a deep breath, and then in broken, heavily accented English, she said, Plants. I need plants. From outside. I show you. Dr. Patterson hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Take her out under guard. Let her gather what she needs. For the next hour, Thomas followed Nalin around the area surrounding the fort. She moved with purpose, searching for specific plants among the desert vegetation. She'd stop at certain bushes or small plants, examine them carefully, then either pick some or move on. Thomas had walked past these same plants 100 times and never given them a second thought. To Nalin, they were a pharmacy. She collected leaves from what Thomas later learned was called creosote bush. She gathered roots from some kind of desert plant he didn't recognize. She even scraped bark from a tree, handling everything with the careful attention of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Her hands moved with practiced skill, and Thomas realized she must have learned all this from her family, probably from her mother or grandmother. This was knowledge passed down through generations. Back at the infirmary, Nalin got to work immediately. She asked for water, a pot, and something to grind the plants with. Dr. Patterson provided what she needed, watching skeptically as she began preparing her medicines. She crushed some leaves into a paste. She boiled roots to make a tea. She mixed different ingredients together with the confidence of someone following a recipe she'd made 1,000 times. Then came the hard part. She had to get sick people to drink her concoctions. The first patient was a young soldier who was so delirious with fever, he barely knew what was happening. Nalin held the cup to his lips and spoke softly in Apache, her voice surprisingly gentle. Something in her tone must have been comforting because the soldier drank without fighting. The waiting was agony. Nobody knew if Nalin's medicines would help or make things worse. Thomas stood near her, ready to pull her away if the soldier's condition deteriorated. But slowly, over the next few hours, something remarkable happened. The soldier's fever began to break. His breathing became easier. By evening, he was actually sleeping peacefully instead of thrashing in delirium. One success didn't convince everyone, but it was enough for Dr. Patterson to let Nalin continue. She moved from patient to patient, giving each one specific treatments based on their symptoms. Some got the tea. Others got paste applied to their foreheads. She worked tirelessly, never complaining, never stopping to rest even though Thomas could see exhaustion in her eyes. What amazed Thomas most was how Nalin treated the sick children. These were the children of soldiers who'd fought against her people, who'd probably killed Apache warriors. She had every reason to hate them. But when Nalin sat beside a crying little girl named Amy, she was nothing but gentle. She held the child's hand and sang something soft in Apache, a lullaby maybe, until Amy calmed down enough to drink the medicine. The girl's mother watched with tears streaming down her face, unable to speak from the emotion of seeing this enemy show such tenderness to her daughter. By the end of the first day, 3 patients were showing improvement. By the end of the second day, 5 were better. The 2 sick children, including Amy, were recovering faster than anyone. Dr. Patterson stopped looking skeptical and started looking amazed. "I don't understand it," he kept saying. "These plants, this knowledge. We've had doctors here for years and never knew any of this was possible." The other soldiers began to see Nalin differently too. The insults stopped. When she walked through the compound to gather more plants, people nodded respectfully instead of glaring. Some even thanked her, though their gratitude was awkward and uncertain. They didn't know how to reconcile the image of the enemy they'd been taught to fear with this tired young woman who was saving their lives. Thomas watched all of this with a strange feeling growing in his chest. Pride, maybe, though he had no right to feel proud of something Nalin had done on her own. Or perhaps it was vindication. He'd known from the moment he captured her that there was something special about her, something strong and good that had nothing to do with which side of a war she'd been born on. On the 5th day after the outbreak started, something unexpected happened. Little Amy, who was almost completely recovered, brought Nalin a biscuit from the mess hall. The child didn't speak, just offered the food with a shy smile. Nalin took the biscuit, and for the first time since Thomas had known her, she smiled back. It was a small smile, barely there, but it transformed her whole face. She looked younger suddenly, less like a hardened survivor and more like the teenage girl she actually was. That night, after all the patients were resting comfortably, Helen approached Nalin with tears in her eyes. Through Thomas, who was learning to translate basic ideas between them, Helen thanked Nalin for saving her nephew, one of the sick children. Nalin seemed uncomfortable with the gratitude. She said something in Apache that Thomas roughly translated as, "Life is precious, all life." The cholera outbreak eventually passed, as these things do. Not everyone survived, but far more people lived than would have without Nalin's help. Dr. Patterson wrote a detailed report about the plants she'd used and the methods she'd employed. He called her treatments remarkably effective, and admitted that Western medicine had much to learn from Apache healing practices. But the real change wasn't in any report. It was in how people looked at Nalin now. She wasn't the enemy anymore. She wasn't even really a prisoner. She was the girl who'd saved them when she had no obligation to do so. She'd shown them that compassion didn't have borders, and that humanity could exist even in the middle of hatred and war. Thomas saw it in every face at the fort: respect, gratitude, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of understanding. After the outbreak ended, things changed at Fort Bowie. Captain Morrison quietly moved Nalin from the storage room to a small but proper room in one of the buildings where officers' families stayed. It wasn't much, just a bed and a chair and a real window, but it was a world better than being locked in darkness. Nobody objected to the change. How could they after what she'd done? Thomas was still assigned to watch over Nalin, but it felt different now. Less like he was guarding a prisoner, and more like he was protecting someone valuable. He started spending his evenings sitting outside her door, not to keep her in, but to keep trouble away. Some of the soldiers had changed their minds about her, but not all of them. There were still men who muttered that she was Apache and couldn't be trusted, no matter how many lives she'd saved. One evening, about a week after the last cholera patient recovered, Nolan surprised Thomas by sitting down next to him on the porch. Usually she stayed in her room when she wasn't helping in the infirmary. But tonight she had a book in her hands. One of the children's primers used to teach reading. She opened it and pointed to a picture of a dog. "What this?" she asked in her broken English. Thomas understood immediately. She wanted to learn. "Dog," he said clearly. "That's a dog." "Dog," Nolan repeated, her accent thick but her effort obvious. She pointed to the next picture. "What this?" And just like that, their evening lessons began. At first, Thomas taught her simple English words: dog, horse, water, sky, sun. Nolan absorbed everything like sand soaking up rain. She had an incredible memory and rarely needed to be told something twice. Within a few days, she was forming simple sentences. Sky is blue. Water is cold. I want food. But Thomas found himself curious too. He started asking her to teach him Apache words in return. The language was difficult, full of sounds his English-speaking mouth struggled to form. Nolan would laugh sometimes at his terrible pronunciation, a soft sound that made Thomas grin despite his embarrassment. It was nice hearing her laugh. It reminded him that underneath all the pain and hardship, she was still young, still capable of joy. As Nolan's English improved, their conversations deepened. She told him about growing up in the desert, about learning to find water in places that looked completely dry, about tracking animals and reading the sky for weather. Thomas was fascinated. The Apache lived in harmony with a land that seemed determined to kill anyone who didn't understand it. They'd developed wisdom over countless generations, knowledge that most white settlers completely ignored. One night, Thomas worked up the courage to ask the question that had been bothering him since the day he captured her. "Nolan, why were you out there alone that day?" "When I found you?" Her face grew sad. She was quiet for a long time, and Thomas thought maybe he'd pushed too far, but then she started speaking slowly, choosing her English words carefully. "Mexican soldiers come to our camp," she said. "Not American, Mexican. They attack in night. Everyone running, hiding. I get separated from my family. I try to find them for many days. Then your soldiers find me. You think I am Raider, but I was lost girl looking for mother, father, brother." Thomas felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. She hadn't been part of any raid. She'd been a victim, running for her life, trying to reunite with her family. And he'd captured her, dragged her away, locked her up. The guilt hit him so hard he could barely breathe. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing the words were completely inadequate. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Nolan looked at him with those dark, deep eyes. "You not know because you not ask. Soldiers see Apache, think enemy. Not see person. Not see daughter missing her mother. Not see sister worried for brother." Her words cut deep because they were true. Thomas had been taught to see the Apache as problems to solve, threats to eliminate. Nobody had ever suggested they were people with families and feelings and lives as real as his own. The realization made him see everything differently. Every raid, every battle, every casualty on both sides. They were all somebody's child, somebody's parent, somebody's loved one. "Tell me about your family," Thomas said quietly. Nalen's face softened. She told him about her mother, who was a respected healer in their band, the one who taught Nolan everything about medicines and plants. Her father was a skilled hunter who could track a deer for days without losing the trail. Her younger brother was only 8, funny and brave and always getting into trouble. She talked about her grandmother, who told stories around the fire at night, keeping their history alive through words. "I miss them every day," Nolan said, her voice thick with emotion. "I wonder if they look for me. If they think I am dead. My mother, she teach me to heal people. She say, all life is sacred, Nolan. Apache life, enemy life, all same to the spirits. This is why I help your people when they sick. Because my mother teach me this." Thomas was quiet, absorbing this. Then he told Nolan about his own family. His father, who'd died when Thomas was 12. His mother, who'd remarried a man Thomas couldn't stand. His decision to join the army just to get away from home, to find some kind of purpose. He'd thought the military would give him direction, make him into someone important. Instead, it had brought him here, to this complicated situation that was changing everything he thought he knew. As weeks passed, their conversations ranged across countless topics. Nalin told him about Apache beliefs, about their connection to the land, about ceremonies and traditions that went back further than anyone could remember. Thomas shared what he knew about the wider world, about cities and trains and inventions Nalin had never imagined. They talked about the war between their peoples, trying to understand how it had started and why it continued. "Your people want our land," Nalin said one night, her voice matter-of-fact rather than angry. "They make promises, sign papers, then break promises. They say move here, then when we move they say no, move there now. They push and push until there is nowhere left to go." Thomas couldn't argue with her. He'd seen the treaties, heard the orders. The pattern was clear if you looked at it honestly. The government wanted the Apache gone, plain and simple. Either pushed onto reservations or eliminated entirely. Saying it out loud, even just thinking it clearly, made Thomas feel ashamed of wearing his uniform. "It's not right," he said. "What's happening to your people? It's not right." "No," Nalin agreed. "But what is right when people have power to do wrong and nobody stops them?" It was a question Thomas couldn't answer. He was just one soldier, one person. What could he possibly do to fix something so broken, so big? But talking with Nalin, understanding her perspective, at least he could see the truth. That had to count for something, didn't it? The other soldiers noticed the friendship growing between Thomas and Nalin. Some thought it was strange. Others made jokes, though not the cruel kind they'd made before. A few of the older soldiers warned Thomas that getting too friendly with the enemy was dangerous, that he was forgetting which side he was on. Thomas ignored them all. He knew which side he was on. He was on the side of seeing people as people, which apparently was a radical position in 1873. Helen became friends with Nalin too. She'd bring her tea in the evenings and sit with them during the language lessons. Helen had lost a son to scarlet fever years ago, and something about Nalin seemed to ease that old grief. Nalin, for her part, seemed to appreciate having another woman to talk to. Helen taught her to sew in the American style, and Nalin showed Helen how Apache women created beautiful patterns with beadwork. Little Amy, the girl Nalin had helped save from cholera, became Nalin's shadow. She'd follow her around the fort, chattering away in English that Nalin was still learning to fully understand. Amy's mother didn't discourage it. "That girl saved my baby's life," she told Thomas once. "If Amy wants to spend every waking moment with her, that's fine by me." Thomas watched all these connections forming and felt something like hope. Maybe people from different worlds could understand each other. Maybe the hatred and violence weren't inevitable. Maybe there was another way forward if enough people were willing to see it. But even as these thoughts gave him comfort, Thomas knew their time was running out. Captain Morrison had received his orders. Transport to the San Carlos reservation was being arranged. In 2 weeks, maybe 3, Nalin would be taken away. The thought of it made Thomas's chest tighten with anxiety. San Carlos had a terrible reputation. Overcrowded, undersupplied, more like a prison than a place where people could actually live. He hadn't told Nalin yet. He didn't know how. Every evening when they sat together, talking and laughing and learning from each other, the secret sat heavy in Thomas's heart. He knew he had to tell her soon. But how do you tell someone you've come to care about that you're sending them to a place that might destroy their spirit, if not their body? How do you admit that you're part of the system crushing them, even as you sit there pretending to be their friend? The answer was you didn't know. You just knew that when the time came, you'd have to choose. And Thomas was starting to realize that his choice might cost him everything he'd built in his life as a soldier, but keeping Nalin safe he was beginning to think might be worth any price. The orders came on a Tuesday morning. Captain Morrison called Thomas into his office and handed him the paperwork without ceremony. "You'll escort the Apache girl to San Carlos Reservation next Monday," Morrison said. "There'll be 2 other soldiers accompanying you for security. The journey should take about a week." Thomas stared at the papers in his hands, feeling sick. "Sir, I've heard things about San Carlos. It's not a good place. The conditions there are not our concern, Reed," Morrison interrupted. "We have our orders. The girl will be transferred, and that's the end of it. You're dismissed." Walking out of that office, Thomas felt like he was carrying a death sentence in his hands. San Carlos was notorious throughout the territory. Different Apache bands who'd been enemies for generations were forced to live together in close quarters. Food was scarce. Disease was common. The reservation was run by corrupt agents who skimmed supplies meant for the Apache people. It was a place where hope went to die. Thomas didn't tell Nayland right away. He spent that whole day trying to figure out if there was any way around it. Could he convince Morrison to delay the transfer? No, the captain was just following orders from higher up. Could he appeal to someone with more authority? He was a low-ranking scout with no connections and no influence. Could he take Nalin and run? Where would they go? How would they survive with the entire army looking for them? Every option seemed impossible. But doing nothing, letting Nalin be sent to San Carlos, that felt impossible too. Thomas lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his barracks, his mind spinning in circles. By morning, he still had no answers. Just a growing certainty that he couldn't be part of destroying the person who'd taught him to see beyond his own narrow view of the world. He finally told Nalin 2 days later. They were sitting in their usual spot, and Nalin was practicing writing English words in the dirt with a stick. She'd gotten quite good at it, her letters careful and precise. Thomas watched her form the word freedom and felt his throat tighten. "Nalin, I need to tell you something," he said quietly. She looked up at him, immediately sensing from his tone that something was wrong. "What is it?" "There are orders. In 5 days I'm supposed to take you to San Carlos Reservation." The stick fell from Nalin's hand. For a long moment she didn't move, didn't speak. Then she said very quietly, "I know of this place. People who go to San Carlos, their spirits die even if their bodies live." "I know," Thomas said miserably. "I've heard the same things." Nalin stood up and walked a few steps away, her back to him. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but sad. "This was always going to happen. I knew from the beginning. I am Apache. You are soldier. The world does not care that we have become friends. It only cares about the rules." "There has to be another way," Thomas said, standing up too. "Maybe I can help you escape. I could create a distraction, leave a horse ready, and then what?" Nalin turned to face him. "You would be punished. Maybe imprisoned. Maybe shot for treason, and I would be alone in the wilderness with soldiers hunting me. Unable to find my family, probably caught again within days. This is not a solution, Thomas. This is just a different kind of ending. So what, we just give up? I'm supposed to just hand you over to a place that will break you?" Nalin walked back to him and placed her hand on his arm. "You are a good man with good heart, but you are one person in a machine much bigger than you. Some things we cannot fight. We can only survive them." Her acceptance of it, her resignation, made Thomas angry. Not at her, but at everything. At the system that had created this situation. At the generals who gave orders from comfortable offices far away. At the politicians who signed treaties they had no intention of honoring. At himself for being too powerless to change any of it. That night Thomas couldn't eat. He sat in the mess hall, pushing food around his plate while other soldiers talked and laughed around him. Helen sat down across from him, took one look at his face and immediately understood. "She's being transferred," Helen said. It wasn't a question. "Monday," Thomas confirmed. Helen was quiet for a moment. "There's nothing you can do? Nothing that won't make things worse?" "I'm sorry, Thomas. I know you care about her." He did care about her. Somewhere over the past weeks, Nalin had become one of the most important people in his life. She challenged everything he thought he knew about right and wrong, about enemies and friends. She'd shown him that the lines people drew between us and them were mostly illusions. And now he was going to be the one to deliver her into a living hell, all because he didn't have the courage to stand up and say no. The next 3 days passed in a blur of misery. Thomas went through his duties mechanically, barely aware of what he was doing. Nalin continued her routines, helping in the infirmary, playing with Amy, studying her English. But Thomas noticed she'd stopped laughing. The light had gone out of her eyes. She was preparing herself for what was coming, building walls around her heart to protect herself from the pain she knew was ahead. On Sunday night, the evening before the transfer, Nalin asked Thomas to sit with her. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun set over the desert. The sky turned orange, then pink, then deep purple. Stars began to appear one by one like tiny holes poked in a dark blanket. "Thomas," Nalin said finally, "I want to tell you something true. When you first capture me, I hate you very much. I think this man is my enemy. I will kill him if I get chance. But you show me kindness when you didn't have to. You try to understand me when everyone else just saw Apache. You become my friend when the world say we should be enemies. This time with you, learning and talking, it has been gift. Even though it ends badly, I am grateful for it. Thomas felt tears burning in his eyes. You saved my life from that rattlesnake. You saved the lives of people in this fort who would have gladly seen you dead. You taught me that being a good person matters more than following orders. Nalin, you're one of the bravest, kindest people I've ever met. And I'm about to betray all of that by taking you to San Carlos. You are not betraying me, Nalin said firmly. You are trapped, same as me. The real enemy is not you. It is the hatred that makes people see only differences, not the ways we are same. They sat in silence again. Then Nalin did something unexpected. She reached into her dress and pulled out a small silver bracelet. It was simple but beautiful, engraved with a pattern that looked like waves or wind. She held it out to Thomas. This was my mother's, she explained. Her mother gave it to her and she gave it to me before. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. It is the only thing I have from my old life. I want you to have it. Nalin, no, Thomas protested. I can't take this. It's too precious. Please, she insisted, pressing it into his hand. When you look at it, remember that Apache are people. We love our families. We value kindness. We are not the enemy your army says we are. Remember this, and maybe someday you can help make things better. Even small changes matter. Thomas closed his fingers around the bracelet. It was still warm from her skin. I'll keep it safe, he promised. And Nalin, I swear to you, I'll find a way to help. I don't know how yet, but I won't forget you. I won't forget what you've taught me. That night, Thomas lay in his bunk and made a decision. He couldn't stop Nalin from being transferred. He couldn't fix the entire broken system. But he could do one thing. He could help her escape before they reached San Carlos. It would cost him his career, maybe his freedom. But some things were more important than a career. Some friendships were worth any price. He spent the entire night working out the details. They'd be traveling for about a week with 2 other soldiers as escort. On the 3rd or 4th night, when they were far enough from the fort but not yet close to San Carlos, he'd create an opportunity. Leave a horse ready. Make sure she had supplies. Point her in the direction where Apache bands were known to roam. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was something. It was action instead of helpless acceptance. As the sun rose on Monday morning, Thomas felt calmer than he had in days. He was terrified, yes. He knew the consequences of what he was planning. But he also knew he'd never be able to live with himself if he didn't at least try. Nalin had saved lives when she didn't have to. Now it was his turn to return the favor. Whatever happened after that, he'd face it. But he wouldn't be the person who sent Nalin to San Carlos without a fight. He couldn't be that person. Not anymore. The journey to San Carlos began on a gray Monday morning. Thomas rode alongside Nalin, while 2 other soldiers, Jackson and Williams, followed behind. Neither of them seemed particularly interested in the assignment. They were just doing their jobs, counting the days until they could get back to the fort. Nalin rode in silence, her face expressionless. She'd pulled her hair back tightly and wore a simple dress Helen had given her. To anyone watching, she looked calm, resigned to her fate. But Thomas noticed her hands gripping the reins too tightly, her jaw clenched. She was terrified, just hiding it well. The first 2 days of travel were tense but uneventful. They rode through the desert heat, made camp at night, and started again each morning. Jackson and Williams mostly ignored Nalin, treating her like cargo instead of a person. It made Thomas angry, but he kept his mouth shut. He needed them to stay complacent, to not suspect what he was planning. On the 2nd night, Thomas started laying the groundwork for his plan. He volunteered to take the first watch, claiming he couldn't sleep anyway. This wasn't unusual. He'd been restless the whole trip. What the other soldiers didn't know was that he was using this time to prepare supplies, a little extra food hidden in saddlebags, an extra canteen filled with water, a knife tucked into a spot where Nalin could reach it easily. The 3rd day brought them to rough terrain, full of rocks and narrow canyons. It was slow going, and by evening everyone was exhausted. They made camp in a small canyon that offered protection from the wind. Thomas watched the sun set and knew this was the night. They were far enough from the fort that immediate pursuit would be difficult, but not yet close enough to San Carlos that there would be extra soldiers or officials around. As the other men settled in for the night, Thomas felt his heart hammering in his chest. He'd gone over the plan 100 times in his head. Wait until Jackson and Williams were asleep. Wake Nalin quietly. Get her on a horse with supplies. Point her north, where he knew Apache bands sometimes ranged. Then let her go and face whatever consequences came. The waiting was torture. Thomas sat by the fire, pretending to be relaxed while his insides twisted with nervousness. Jackson fell asleep quickly, snoring loudly. Williams took longer, but eventually his breathing slowed and deepened. Thomas gave it another 30 minutes to be sure, then slowly stood up. He moved carefully toward where Nalin lay wrapped in a blanket. He'd expected her to be asleep, but her eyes opened immediately when he approached. She'd been awake, waiting. Smart girl. Thomas put his finger to his lips and gestured for her to follow him. Nalin moved like a ghost, completely silent. They crept toward where the horses were tethered. Thomas had already picked out the fastest one and loaded it with the supplies he'd hidden. His own horse stood nearby, and suddenly Thomas made a decision he hadn't planned on. He couldn't let Nalin go out there with just one horse. If something happened to it, she'd be stranded. She needed 2 horses for safety. He quickly saddled both animals, working as quietly as possible. Every small sound seemed impossibly loud in the night. Any second he expected Jackson or Williams to wake up and raise the alarm. But luck was on their side. Both men continued sleeping. When the horses were ready, Thomas led them away from camp with Nalin walking beside him. They moved carefully through the darkness, putting distance between themselves and the sleeping soldiers. Only when they were far enough away that talking wouldn't wake anyone did Thomas stop. "Nalin," he whispered urgently. "There's food and water in the saddlebags. A knife, too. Head north from here. Stay in the canyons during the day and travel at night. There are Apache bands in the northern territories. If you can find them—" "Thomas, no," Nalin interrupted. She was looking at both horses, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You give me 2 horses. Your horse. They will know you helped me. They will punish you." "I know," Thomas said. "I don't care. You should care. This is your life, your future. My future isn't worth more than your freedom," Thomas said firmly. "Nalin, you saved lives at that fort. You showed compassion to people who'd shown you none. You deserve better than San Carlos. You deserve to go home to find your family. So please, just take the horses and go." Nalin stared at him for a long moment. In the moonlight, he could see tears shining in her eyes. Then she did something completely unexpected. She pulled the silver bracelet from her pocket, his mother's bracelet, the one she'd given him days ago, and held it out to him. "You gave this back?" Thomas was confused. "No," Nalin said. "You keep yours, I keep mine. Look." She pulled up her sleeve and showed him an identical bracelet on her wrist. "My mother had 2. One for me, one for my brother. I gave you mine before. Now I show you I have his. When I find my family again, I give him back his bracelet. And someday, if there is ever peace between our peoples, I will find you and you will give me back mine. This is my promise. We will meet again, Thomas Reed. I will make sure of it." Thomas felt his throat close up with emotion. He took the bracelet she'd given him earlier from his pocket, where he'd been keeping it safe, and put it on his wrist under his sleeve. "I'll keep it until that day," he promised. Nalin stepped forward and did something that shocked Thomas. She placed her hand over his heart, right over where it was beating hard and fast. "Good men live here," she said in her accented English. "World needs more good men like you. Don't let Army make you forget who you are." Then, before Thomas could respond, she swung up onto one of the horses. She took the reins of the second horse and looked down at him. For a moment she just stared, like she was memorizing his face. Then she nodded once and turned the horse north. Thomas watched her ride away into the darkness, leading the second horse behind her. She moved confidently, even in the dim moonlight. Within minutes, she'd disappeared into the shadows of the canyon. Thomas stood there alone, listening to the fading sound of hoofbeats, and felt like his heart was being torn in two. Relief that she was free. Grief that she was gone. Fear for what would happen to him now. Pride that he'd done the right thing, even though it was the hard thing. He made his way back to camp slowly. There was no point in running or hiding. Where would he go? He'd made his choice. Now he'd face the consequences like a man. When he reached the camp, he found Jackson and William still sleeping. Thomas sat down by the dying fire and waited for morning. He didn't sleep. He just sat there thinking about Nalin riding through the night toward freedom. Toward home. Toward a future that didn't include being broken in a reservation. Whatever happened to him now, that image would be worth it. Dawn came slowly. The sky lightened from black to gray to pink. Birds started singing. Jackson woke up first, yawning and stretching. Then he looked around and frowned. Where's your horse, Reed? And where's the girl? She escaped, Thomas said flatly. Overpowered me and took my horse. Rode off north about 2 hours ago. Jackson jumped to his feet, swearing. Williams woke up in a panic. They both started firing questions at Thomas. When did it happen? Why didn't he wake them? How did a girl overpower a trained soldier? Thomas gave them the story he'd prepared. She'd waited until he was drowsy during his watch. Hit him with a rock. By the time he recovered, she was gone. It was a weak story, and they both knew it. Jackson looked at Thomas with suspicion clearly written on his face. You expect us to believe a teenage girl knocked you out and stole your horse without making enough noise to wake us? Believe what you want, Thomas said tiredly. That's what happened. They argued for a while, but eventually they had to accept it. They couldn't prove Thomas had helped her, even if they suspected it. And standing around arguing wasn't going to bring Nullen back. They needed to report to their superiors and let them decide what to do next. The ride back to Fort Bowie was miserable. Jackson and Williams barely spoke to Thomas, and when they did, it was with cold suspicion. Thomas didn't care. He kept touching the bracelet hidden under his sleeve and thinking about Nullen, hoping she was already far away, already safe. When they reached the fort, Captain Morrison was furious. He listened to Thomas's story with a face that got redder and redder. Then he exploded. This is unacceptable, Reed. You had one simple job. One job. And you let her escape. Sir, I don't want to hear it, Morrison shouted. You're demoted to private effective immediately. You'll spend the next month on latrine duty. And if I find out you helped that girl escape, if I find any evidence at all, you'll be court-martialed. Do you understand me? Yes, sir, Thomas said. He was dismissed in disgrace. The other soldiers whispered about him as he walked across the compound. Some thought he was incompetent. Others thought he'd been bribed or seduced. A few suspected the truth but said nothing. Thomas ignored all of them. He reported for his new duties without complaint. That night, lying in his bunk, Thomas touched the bracelet on his wrist and thought about Nullen's promise. Someday, if there is ever peace between our peoples, I will find you. It seemed impossible. The war between settlers and Apache showed no signs of ending. The hatred ran deep on both sides. Peace seemed like a fantasy. But Thomas had learned something important from Nullen. Sometimes the impossible happened. Sometimes enemies became friends. Sometimes one person's courage could plant a seed that grew into something bigger. 15 years is a long time, long enough for a young cavalry scout to become a man with gray in his hair and lines on his face. Long enough for the world to change in ways both small and large. Long enough, Thomas sometimes thought, to almost forget the girl who'd changed his life. Almost, but not quite. Thomas had left the army 3 years after Nullen's escape. The demotion hadn't been the worst of it. The worst had been seeing how the army treated the Apache people, watching the pattern of broken promises and forced relocations continue year after year. He couldn't be part of it anymore, so he'd turned in his uniform and tried to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. He'd tried a few different jobs, ranch hand, store clerk, even tried his hand at prospecting for a while. Nothing felt quite right. Then, in 1885, something unexpected happened. The territorial governor needed someone to help negotiate with Apache communities about land boundaries and water rights. Someone who understood both sides, who could talk to the Apache with respect instead of threats. Someone recommended Thomas for the job. At first, Thomas wasn't sure he wanted it. Going back to that world, dealing with the conflicts between settlers and Apache, it would bring up all those old memories and feelings. But something made him say yes. Maybe it was the bracelet he still wore under his sleeve every single day. Maybe it was Nullen's words echoing in his mind. Even small changes matter. So Thomas became a frontier negotiator. It wasn't an easy job. Both sides often distrusted him. Settlers thought he was too sympathetic to the Apache. Apache leaders were suspicious of any white official. But slowly, patiently, Thomas built a reputation as someone who listened, who tried to be fair, who kept his word. He helped settle disputes about grazing lands. He negotiated better terms for water access. He prevented more than a few situations that could have turned violent. He never stopped looking for Nullen, though. In every Apache community he visited, he'd ask carefully if anyone knew of a woman named Nullen, a healer who'd once been held at Fort Bowie. But the Apache were understandably cautious about sharing information with any white official, even one who seemed friendly. and Nalin was a common enough name. He heard stories of several women with that name, but none of them seemed to be her. Over the years, Thomas had convinced himself he'd never see her again. She'd probably found her family and was living peacefully somewhere far from white settlements. Or maybe she'd died. Disease, violence, the harsh conditions of reservation life. Any of these could have claimed her. The thought made his heart ache, but he tried to accept it. At least she'd had a chance at freedom because of what he'd done. That had to be enough. In the summer of 1888, Thomas was called to a small settlement near the Arizona-New Mexico border. There was a dispute between some ranchers and a nearby Apache community about land boundaries. The ranchers claimed the Apache were letting their horses graze on private property. The Apache claimed the land had been promised to them in a treaty that the government had ignored. It was a familiar story, the same conflict playing out in slightly different ways. Thomas arrived on a hot afternoon, tired from the long ride. The meeting was set for the next morning in a neutral location, an old trading post that both sides agreed on. Thomas spent the evening reviewing the relevant treaties and land documents, preparing his arguments. He'd gotten good at this over the years, finding the facts, presenting them clearly, helping both sides see where compromise was possible. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the trading post early. The ranchers showed up first, 3 weathered men who clearly weren't happy about having to negotiate at all. Then the Apache delegation arrived. There were 4 of them. 2 older men who were clearly the leaders, a younger man who looked like a warrior, and a woman. Thomas was taking notes, not really looking up, when he heard one of the Apache men say something in their language. Then a woman's voice responded, and something about that voice made Thomas freeze. It was familiar in a way that went deeper than conscious memory, familiar in his bones. He looked up, and the world seemed to stop. The woman was staring at him with wide eyes. She was older now, of course. Her face had matured, showing the experiences of 15 years. But those eyes, those fierce, intelligent, dark eyes, he would have known them anywhere. It was Nalin. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Thomas felt like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Was this real? Or was he imagining things, seeing what he wanted to see? But no, it was her. He was absolutely certain. Nalin recovered first. She turned to the other Apache and said something in their language. One of the older men nodded. Then she looked back at Thomas and, in perfect English with barely a trace of accent, said, "I will translate for my people during these negotiations." Her voice was calm, professional. But Thomas saw her hands shaking slightly. She was as shocked as he was. They both struggled through the next 2 hours, trying to focus on land boundaries and grazing rights when all Thomas could think about was the miracle of finding her alive. Finding her here after all these years, somehow they got through it. Thomas presented the historical documents. The ranchers made their case. The Apache leaders shared their perspective. Nalin translated between English and Apache, her voice steady even though Thomas could see the emotion in her eyes every time she looked at him. They reached a tentative agreement that seemed fair to both sides, pending some surveying work to establish exact boundaries. When the meeting ended and the ranchers left, the 2 Apache men also stood to leave. But Nalin spoke to them quietly, and after a moment they nodded and walked outside, leaving her and Thomas alone in the trading post. The silence stretched between them like a living thing. Thomas didn't know where to start. There was so much to say, so much to ask, that the words tangled up in his throat. Nalin spoke first. "You became a negotiator," she said softly. "You helped both sides talk instead of fight." "I had a good teacher," Thomas replied. "Someone who showed me that understanding was possible even between enemies." Nalin smiled, and it was like the sun coming out after a long winter. "You still remember? I never forgot. Not for a single day." Thomas reached up and pulled back his sleeve, revealing the silver bracelet on his wrist. "I kept my promise. I kept it safe, waiting for the day I could return it to you." Nalin's eyes filled with tears. She reached into a pouch at her waist and pulled out something that made Thomas's heart skip a beat. It was his bracelet, the one she'd given him that last night before she escaped. But she was wearing a different bracelet on her wrist, the one that had belonged to her brother. "I found them," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My family. It took almost a year, but I found them. My mother, my father, my brother. They had been searching for me, too. When I gave my brother back his bracelet, I told him about you, about the white soldier who saved my life by giving me my freedom. What happened to you? Thomas asked. After that night, they sat down and Nalin told her story. The hard journey north, traveling by night and hiding by day. The close calls with patrols. Finally finding a friendly Apache band who helped her locate her own people. The joyful reunion with her family. The years since then, marked by struggle but also by purpose. My mother taught me more healing before she passed, Nalin explained. I became respected in our community for this knowledge. When the government forced us to the reservation, I used my healing to help people survive the sickness and hunger. I learned English better, learned to read and write so I could understand the white man's treaties and laws. I realized that my people needed advocates who could speak both languages, both cultures, so I became a translator, a negotiator, like you. You never married? Thomas asked, then immediately felt awkward for asking. Nalin smiled sadly. I was married. A good man, a warrior named Takota. He died 3 years ago, fighting to protect our families from raiders. But he gave me a great gift before he died. Her eyes brightened. A daughter. Her name is Hope. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Hope, he repeated. Yes, I named her for what you gave me that night 15 years ago. Hope for a better future. Hope that not all white men were enemies. Hope that kindness could exist even in the darkest times. Nalin reached across the table and took Thomas's hand. You risked everything to give me my freedom. You showed me that one person's courage can change another person's entire life. I wanted my daughter to carry that lesson in her very name. They talked for hours after that, catching up on 15 years of life. Thomas told her about leaving the army, about his struggle to find purpose, about how becoming a negotiator had finally made him feel like he was doing something worthwhile. Nalin told him about life on the reservation, about the challenges her people faced, about her work trying to bridge the gap between two worlds that seemed determined to stay at war. It is hard, she admitted. Many of my people do not trust me because I work with white officials. Many white people do not respect me because I am Apache. But I remember what my mother taught me. All life is sacred. And I remember what you showed me. That change happens one person at a time, one act of kindness at a time. As the sun began to set, Nalin said, There is someone I want you to meet. Will you come with me? Thomas followed her outside, where the two Apache men were waiting with the horses.